Chapter 2. An Eel for Gramps. Our town is situated on the edge of the Ozark Mountains, which, as I understand it, is an old, beat-up range that was all torn down by the glaciers a long time ago. Anyway, they're too small to get any real national attention, and they just sit there like little blisters left over from all that ice rubbing across the ground. Most of the farming around here is done in the flat land that spreads out from these mountains northward. Since we're the biggest city in our end of the county, Harleyville is kind of a shopping center for the farmers. In the hills, there's lots of second-growth timberland that will someday be valuable for railroad ties. Right now, this woodland makes fine cover for deer, coon, possum, rabbit, skunk, quail, squirrel, some turkey and otter, black snakes, copperheads, and cottonmouth water moccasins. All through the hills there are small rivers and creeks full of catfish, bluegill, perch, carp, buffalo, and bass. Each spring, and sometimes in the fall, these waterways get up out of their banks and go spewing down into the Gingham River, about 5 miles south of here. The summers are miserably hot, dust and chiggers and whole months without rain. We eat good in the summer, though. Lots of new yellow ears of field corn, fat red tomatoes, thick-hided, black-seeded watermelons that come apart in your mouth like cold candy, fried chicken every Sunday with milk gravy and mashed new potatoes, and maybe a strawberry pie with a couple feet of whipped cream on top to finish off with. Everybody moves outside in the summer, especially at night. Grown-ups get together to swat mosquitoes and pitch horseshoes or play croquet. The kids swat mosquitoes, too, and play kick the can under a streetlight somewhere, or Monopoly on a screened back porch if we can find one. On hot afternoons, and that's just about the only kind there is in summer, we sometimes go out to one of the creeks in our neighborhood for a swim, riding out the 5 miles on our bikes, eating dust all the way, and gulping a gallon of iced tea when we finally get home. During the day, we try to avoid trouble, or, if worst comes to worst, we mow lawns in the neighborhood to get enough money to go to the movie in the afternoon. In winter, it never really gets very cold, according to the thermometer, but it's damp and cloudy almost all the time, with wet snows to clog things up now and then. Our little town is mostly gray and white and black in the winter, drab and boring. But it makes the lighted windows at night look a lot more cozy, especially when there's a homemade wreath hanging on the front door, and it's the house where you were born, and you know it's the place where you belong. Springs and falls around here are something to behold. Every spring, the dogwood bursts out all through the woods, and a little later, the wild plum does too. The mud settles out of the rivers and streams, and the mayflies float on the green water. Day and night, the air smells like wild honey, and you want to get out there in all the new green things and jump like a rabbit. At least I do. We have a lot of picnics then. Almost every Easter, we go down to Gramps' farm. Me and Caleb and Callie are too old for all that Easter rabbit stuff, so we go down to the farm and have a big dinner instead. Last Easter, we went hand fishing too. The day was a real peach, even for April. The sky seemed like it hadn't even heard there was such a thing as clouds, and there was just a touch of wind that you could only notice when you stood in the shade for a while. All the brown fields were green now and pushing upward, a big improvement over the wet brown soil that we'd looked at all winter. The garden had already been planted, and if you looked close, you could just begin to see the tiny radish leaves popping out of the ground. The potato rows were sectioned off into mounds that looked like they might erupt at any minute. The robins had come back early, and just about everywhere you looked, you'd see one of them making off with a chicken feather or a twig to be part of their new nests. Or else they'd be lined up like a row of bobbing machines, out by the feeding trays in the chicken yard, gulping down that laying mash like they were Rhode Island Reds. The hens were leading around raggedy squads of adolescent chicks who were right in the middle of changing from fuzz to feathers and looked like they had mange. There were new March pigs grunting around down in the hog lot, and there was one new calf frisking in the barn lot, with 2 more expected at any time. Mama and Callie had gone right in to help Grandma with the big noontime meal that we always ate when we were at the farm. Gramps said that country folks always had their big meal at noon 'cause they need their strength for a full afternoon of work. And whether it's Sunday or Christmas or even your birthday, when you're a farmer, there's always a full afternoon of work to do. When we first got there, Gramps showed me and Caleb and Papa all around the farm, like he always did, so that we'd be sure to notice the improvements since we'd been there last. After that, he and Papa went back up on the front porch and smoked and talked. "What'll we do?" asked Caleb. "We could go down in the woods and climb trees," I offered. We always climb trees." "Hey, I got it. Let's go fishing, Bud. It's warm enough, and we might do some good." Gramps had a creek running through one corner of his farm, and me and Caleb had always had pretty good luck there. "Yeah," I agreed. "Let's get the poles." "And worms. We'll need lots of worms." We dug 2 or 3 dozen down at the lower end of the garden, the part which hadn't been planted yet. The way me and Caleb dug for worms, you wouldn't have to plow that ground to use it, and I think that's just why Gramps had sent us down there. Then we got Papa to get the poles down from the rafters in the garage. "It's only an hour or so till dinner," he cautioned, "and I don't want to have to come looking for you two." "No, sir," I said. "By the way," said Gramps, as we got ready to go, "there's a lot of eels in that creek, and you may run into some of them. There's not a man in Ogato County who could hold on to an eel unless he knows how to." "Who wants to?" said Caleb. I agreed. "You would if you'd ever tasted one. You pickle them in vinegar and sugar, and I tell you they're fine." Caleb looked at me, and we both knew right then that we weren't eating any eels, pickled, scalped, or dipped in chocolate sauce. "The only way you can handle them," Gramps continued, "is to loop your middle finger over them and leave your other fingers underneath. Then when you squeeze, it puts a bend in the eel so he can't slide out of your hand. Get it?" I got it. So did Caleb. "Well, if you catch any eels, you bring 'em home, understand?" ordered Gramps. "Yeah," said Caleb. "Sure, Gramps," I said. We took off through the barn lot and down the hill, me carrying the poles and Caleb carrying the worms and tackle box. "If I even see an eel," Caleb commented, "I'm going to throw my pole in the creek and come home." Caleb was walking behind me because he didn't like to look out for snakes, and I didn't mind. Spring is one of the worst times of the year for snake bite in our part of the country. On warm days in April and May, the copperheads and moccasins come out of their rocky holes and lie where the sun can hit them. Copperheads are the worst. Even in the middle of summer, they don't try to get away from you. They just lie there and wait, looking exactly like the rocks and the grass around them. And Lord help the feller who plants a size 10 in their vicinity, 'cause he's gonna get hit. I'd heard all the stories about snakes, but hadn't ever gotten mixed up with one close up. Maybe that's why I was confident. When we got to the bottom of the hill, we made our way carefully through a wide meadow where the heavy bluegrass was beginning to grow up through the dead stalks from last year. Gramps' cows spend most of their time in that meadow because the grass is so rich. In the middle of it was the creek. Just as we caught sight of it, a great big bass flopped over out in the middle, and me and Caleb ran the rest of the way. It took us a few minutes to convince the worms onto our hooks and get our lines unrolled from the poles and rigged. We held on to our poles, waiting for the corks to start bobbing. When they didn't, we pushed the ends of the poles into the soft mud on the creek bank and waited some more. Nothing happened. After a while, Caleb looked over at me. "What's the matter with those dumb fish anyhow?" he asked me. "Maybe they're not hungry," I suggested. "Maybe they're not, but I sure am. You think it's about time for dinner? He asked. I guess so, I answered. We might as well go on back. Fish just aren't hungry. We wound up our lines and went back to the house, disappointed with our luck, but pleased by the smell we caught when we got near the kitchen. Grandma had done up 2 or 3 fryers, and there were peas and milk gravy and mashed potatoes and biscuits and everything else to go with the fried chicken. Mama brought out a great big devil's food cake for dessert with all the extra icing we wanted to put on top of it, and me and Caleb ate so much we almost died. Couldn't do any good, huh? Asked Gramps, while the women cleared off the table. We were so stuffed we could just sit there like a couple of Easter eggs, staring at one another. Nope, I said with effort. The fish weren't hungry, Gramps, Caleb added. Well, you ought to stay around till evening, Gramps went on. I'd show you some real fishin'. Gramps was working away on his mouth with a toothpick, and it was kind of hard to understand him. None of those baby bream or perch either. Real fish. Where would you get those fish to show us? Caleb wanted to know. Gramps just laughed. Then he turned to Papa. Any chance of you staying a little late tonight, Orville? I'd enjoy taking these boys hand fishing. They're old enough now, and it's been a good year for it. Some big buffalo and cats lately. They're getting 'em over at the river. Papa had been raised in St. Louis, so he didn't know any more about hand fishing than me and Caleb did. What kind of fishing? Papa asked. With your hands at night, Gramps answered. You get a boat and a lantern and a gunny sack. Then you find a hole about 3 or 4 feet deep and work your way along the bank, feeling in among the roots and logs until you find a fish. They won't move either. You just grab 'em and throw 'em in the sack. You mean you can really catch fish that way? Asked Papa. Why, sure, said Gramps. It's one of the best ways I know of. Can we, Papa? Asked Caleb. Please, Papa? I added. Papa looked into the kitchen where Mama was drying dishes. Mama just shrugged her shoulders. Well, I guess so, said Papa. So that night, just about dark, me and Caleb and Gramps took the pickup truck and drove out about 1.5 miles over to the river. The gingham gets wide right where Gramps kept his rowboat, and after fishing in that silly little creek at the farm, the river looked like an ocean or something. In a few minutes, we were out on that black water, with Gramps rowing us to some hand fishing place that he knew about. Now don't forget I told you about an eel. Middle finger over his back and the rest of your fingers under him. I'm sure hungry for a good mess of pickled eels, Gramps reminded us when we got to the place. It was fully dark by then, and the frogs and early tree toads were whooping it up from the willow trees that lined the shore. This is the spot, all right, said Gramps in a low tone, poking his oar down to the bottom to make sure it was the right depth. Now, skinny out of your clothes and over the side. What? Said Caleb. Take off your clothes. You gotta wade in the water up to your neck if you're gonna hand fish, explained Gramps. I don't think Caleb had realized this before. We gotta do what? Demanded Caleb. Get into the water, said Gramps. It's only about 3 feet deep here. In the water? Asked Caleb. Well, sure. How do you expect to grab those fish if you aren't in the water? Inquired Gramps patiently. I don't, said Caleb. The only thing I'm going to grab is that oar in case I see something moving out on the water. Oh, sassafras, said Gramps. Maybe you're too little to go hand fishing after all. That did it. I skinnied out of my clothes and stood there in the front of the boat for a moment, shivering in the damp river air. I'll do it, I said, sounding braver than I felt. That a boy, encouraged Gramps. Sucker, Caleb chided. The water was surprisingly warm. I lowered myself down into its blackness, holding firmly to the side of the boat. I'll admit that I was going strictly on nerve. I'd rather have done anything than climb into that river, but I couldn't chicken out in front of Gramps. And anyhow, I was showing Caleb up. Slowly as I could, I let myself down until the water stood right around my waist. I kept pointing down with my big toe to find the bottom. Finally, I found it. What the dickens, said Gramps. Why are you sitting on my lap? I thought you weren't afraid to get in the water. "Well, what's that stuff on the bottom?" "What stuff?" "That slimy stuff. I tried to stand up on it and it sank clear up to my ankles. That stuff's terrible." "What did I tell you?" Caleb smirked. "It's just mud on the river bottom," said Gramps. He said it like that made it all right, but it didn't. "Cripes," I complained. "It hasn't got a bottom." "Sure it has," said Gramps. "It's only 1.5 feet deep at the most. Just plain old mud." I went back in. My toes felt their way carefully through about a foot of that junk on the bottom before I hit solid ground. I stood there a minute and tried to get used to it. The moon had come up now, and it made a silver coating on the water before me, and I felt like a head and shoulders floating around on top of the water with no lower part attached. All of a sudden, I remembered those big snapping turtles I'd seen lying out on logs sunning themselves the last time we'd come out to the river. "Are there any turtles around here?" I asked Gramps. "If there are, they'll get out of your way fast enough," Gramps assured me. "Well, they better, or I will." "What do I do next?" "Work your way over to that bank over there while I light the lantern. When you get there, feel around the roots of that big willow tree growing at the edge of the water. When you feel a fish, grab him through the gills and haul him out here. We'll put him in the sack. And don't forget about how to catch eels." I wouldn't know an eel from an alligator, I thought, but I made my way up to the bank that he'd pointed to. It was even scarier away from the boat. You never knew what to expect when you put your foot down in that slime, and the depth of the water changed every few yards. When I got near the bank, I felt right under those tree roots just like Gramps had told me to do. Way back in one corner of the hollow, beneath the tree, my hand hit something cold and soft, different from anything else I'd touched in the water. I yanked my hand back. "Hey!" I yelled. "I felt something." "Well, of course you did," Gramps hollered back. "What you think we're doing out here, playing hide and seek?" I knew we weren't playing hide and seek, so I went back to that willow and felt in the hole again. Whatever it was still there. Slowly and very softly, I felt along the thing. I felt a fin. It was bigger than anything I had ever caught on a hook and a line. Suddenly, I forgot about the goo underfoot and the turtles and everything else. I just wanted that fish. I had to have it. I felt him again and figured that he was facing out toward the river where I was standing. Carefully, I found the gill slit and poked my thumb up into it fast and hard the way Gramps had said, and I held on. At first, it felt like the end of my arm was going to get pulled off. I wrestled that fish out of the hole and lost my balance, ducking completely under the water, but I held on. Finally, that fish got tired of fighting, and I pulled him out. "I've got him!" I shouted. "I've got him!" "What is it, an eel?" yelled Gramps. "It feels like a bowl," I said, making my way toward the light of the lantern. When I got him to the boat, Gramps held the light down to see what I had caught. "Good one, Bud. It's a carp. Nice size, too," Gramps said. Caleb just stared at my fish with his mouth open. "Did you really catch that thing with your hands?" he asked. "Sure," I said proudly. Caleb began to undress. "How's the water, Bud?" he asked me. "Fine," I said. My carp was flopping around in the sack at the bottom of the boat. The first thing you know, Caleb had grabbed himself a buffalo just a little bit smaller than my carp. "This is really great," Caleb said to me as we started back for another try. "You betcha," I sung out. I tried underneath an old log that slanted down into the water from the bank. Again, I felt a fish, but this time I must have scared him or something because he flopped his tail and was gone. "I get the next one," insisted Caleb. The next spot turned out to be a kind of cave at the bottom of a small limestone cliff. "That's a dandy," whispered Caleb, working his way over to the opening in the rock. The water got a little deeper there, and Caleb had to stand on his tiptoes and point his chin up in the air to keep above water. "Too deep?" I asked him hopefully. "You want me to get this one?" Nope," said Caleb. He sounded funny talking in that position. I watched as he worked his way right up next to the cave. I'm reaching in now, he whispered. Sides are all smooth. His head was inside the cave now. I couldn't see him, but I could hear him. His voice echoed in there. Can't seem to find the end of it, he went on. Whoa! What's the matter? I asked. Just brushed by something. Felt like another buffalo. A bigger one. We'll get it, I urged. I'm trying, he said. Holy crow, Bud, it's round. What? This thing is round, not flat like a fish. Goodbye, Caleb, I said. Wait a minute, Bud. It's bigger, too, bigger than my arm. Well, you stand there and measure it. I'm going back to the boat, I told him. Hold on. I think it's an eel. How do you know? I asked. I don't know. But it feels the way Gramps says they feel. Long and slick. Well, if you're not afraid, put your middle finger over him and squeeze so he can't get away. All right, said Caleb. Gramps won't think I'm a sissy when I bring him an eel, will he, Bud? I don't guess he will, I answered with an odd feeling in my stomach. Well, here goes, said Caleb. I heard the water in that little cave begin thrashing around, like when you give a cat a bath. I've got him, shouted Caleb. Man, he's big. He's wrapping all around my arm. Well, don't lose him for Pete's sake. Drag him back to the boat. I can't pull him out of this cave, Bud. He's pulling too hard. Try, I said. Slowly, Caleb worked his way out of the cave and over to where Gramps was sitting in the boat. I was right behind him. Gramps was holding up the lantern and peering at us. What's all the commotion? He wanted to know. You boys have another one already? I got an eel for you, Gramps, Caleb said proudly. Hot darn, said Gramps. There's nothing like a good mess of pickled eel. By then we were up to the boat, and Gramps held the sack open for Caleb. With the other hand, he held the lantern over our heads. Go ahead and throw him in, Caleb, ordered Gramps. And don't let go till he's inside the sack. Caleb pulled and grunted until he had his arm just under the water. He's all twined around my arm, he explained. He's not going to let go. Slowly, Caleb's arm came up out of the water. Twined around it, from his hand all the way to his shoulder, was the biggest, cotton-mouthed water moccasin I had ever seen in my life, even in the zoo at Joplin. Its head still dangled off in the water somewhere. Caleb, of course, wouldn't know a water moccasin from a ukulele, but me and Gramps knew. We both just froze, staring at all that snake. Let go there, you big old eel, laughed Caleb, shaking his arm as he held it over the sack. Go ahead and get him, Gramps. No, hollered Gramps. And don't shake him any more. Huh? Said Caleb. He was confused by Grandpa's different-sounding voice. Why can't I shake him off in the bag, Gramps? Does that make him taste bad or something? Just don't do it, commanded Gramps, getting his voice back under control. You just stand still, you hear me? Don't move. Why, Gramps? Said Caleb. You mean to say you're afraid of a little old eel? And you're the one that likes to eat them so much. It's a... I started to say, but Gramps cut me off. Shut up, Bud, he warned. By the lantern light, I could see that sweat had popped out all over his face. Boo, Gramps, laughed Caleb, poking the snake up at him. You cut that out, roared Gramps. You just put your middle finger over him and all your other fingers under him and squeeze, teased Caleb. Caleb, you let it go. Real easy in the water. You let that eel go, Gramps persuaded. He's too little to keep. It's against the law to keep them if they're that small. Too little? Argued Caleb angrily. Why, if he'd been any bigger, he'd have put me in a sack. Will you just let him go, Caleb? No, I'm not going to let him go, insisted Caleb. I'll put 'em in that sack myself if you're too scared to." And with that, he threw his leg over the side of the boat and climbed right in, snake and all. The sudden weight on the boat's side and Gramps' decision to visit the other end of the boat at the same time brought about the results you might expect. Next thing I knew, Gramps was splashing around in the water next to me, and the lantern hissed and went out, and Caleb was yelling about his eel. After a while, Gramps managed to get the boat right side up, with most of the water out of it, and he and I climbed in. Caleb was still standing in the waist-deep water. "Quick, get him in the boat!" hollered Gramps. "Caleb," I said, helping him aboard. "Caleb, are you all right?" "Well, sure," he said, mad as can be, "but you two nitwits let my big eel get away." When we made sure that Caleb wasn't snake-bitten anywhere, Gramps kind of wilted over the middle seat of the boat, and I got out and pulled the boat back to where we had left the truck. We'd lost all our fish, and our taste for fishing, too. We told Caleb what it was all about on the way back, and I thought he was going right up through the roof of the truck. We never did tell Mama or Papa about Caleb's eel, though. All I have to do now to get a rise out of Gramps is to ask to go hand fishing whenever we're at the farm. He just kind of looks at me and smiles.